This is Low Budget Visions, the podcast celebrating personal DIY independent filmmaking, with your host, Matt Berry.
This is Low Budget Visions. Thanks for tuning in. My guest today is filmmaker and musician, Ben Hozie. Ben is the vocalist with BODEGA, and director, as a writer-director of feature films like Annunciation, The Lion's Den, Private Chat, and the upcoming Jack London Calling, which we're going to talk about here shortly. Ben, first, welcome to Low Budget Visions. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Matt.
So we have actually met back at NYU, a number of years ago. And at that time, you were just starting to make, it was your first feature, Annunciation, which was the adaptation of the Road Altarpiece triptych. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about how you got to a point where you were ready to make that feature. And I wanted, after you tell us a little bit about that, I wanted to jump into the article that you'd written for Talk House about your first two feature films. So, but I just want to start with a little bit of background. If you want to tell everybody a bit about yourself, and then you can lead into how Annunciation came to be.
Yeah, so I met you when we were at NYU. We were both in the cinema studies program, which for people that don't know is not, you never touch a camera. It's not about training to become a filmmaker. It's more philosophical or historical, about the history and theory of film. And I was also a philosophy student, so it spoke to my heart. I always, like you, I'm sure, Matt, always had ambitions of making films.
Yeah.
But I was a very heady young man. But as soon as I graduated from college, I started working all sorts of odd jobs, and some of them were on sets of films, which is funny to me, to after being so invested in the theory of film, to suddenly find myself on a set and being struck with the practicalities of people shooting coverage and stuff like that. I'm so naive that I'll tell you a funny story. I worked on this feature film called Privacy, which was sort of like this tech remake of Rear Window, ultra low budget, went straight to, I guess, DVD back then. I don't even know if VOD was where it was at now. I'm talking like 2010 or something like that. I answered a Craigslist ad to be the assistant to the director. Now, I thought that meant I was going to be like the AD, which for people that don't know, I guess if movie people are listening to this, they probably know, but the AD, your job is the person that controls the time on the set. You say, okay, I'm going to give you guys 30 minutes to do this shot, and then we got to change, company move to a new location, and then you guys have 3 hours to do these pages from the script here, blah, blah, blah. So I was really excited and fired up that I was going to be the AD on a feature film. And then when I finally met the director, I was like, you're the assistant to the director, which is not the assistant director. That means I get the coffee and take phone calls or whatever for the director when he's too busy, it was still a cool experience. I met a lot of good friends on that set, and learned actually how movies work in a very practical sense. But I quickly realized the way to make movies is not to do the trad thing where you PA on movies for 10 years and then eventually you crew on movies, and then eventually you build enough knowledge or goodwill or whatever that now you can make your movie. I don't think it really works that way. And especially the type of movies that I want to make, I don't consider myself as part of the film industry. People always ask, well, what do you think about the industry? I was like, I don't know. I'm not part of the industry. I write and direct movies, and I hope they reach an audience, but I don't do them through any kind of studio system. Obviously, we work with distributors. I guess you could argue that's through an industry, but to me, they're really homemade movies with a close group of friends. And I quickly realized, okay, let's try to do something like that. So I wrote this movie called Annunciation. I made it with my friend Simon Liu, who's a great experimental filmmaker, another person I knew from NYU, and he DP'd it, but he also helped edit it. I mean, it was really me and Simon who made that first movie, Annunciation. And it was, there's nothing like a first movie. whether it works or not, everybody's debut is always telling, because before you acquire too much wisdom and experience, the choices you make are really, really revealing. I would say the same is true of novelists, like your first book or a band, your first record. There's a naivete that you just can't fake when you're really swinging for the fences. I mean, Matt, I really had this idea. I made that movie when I was 22, that I was going to be this boy wonder that was going to be the Godard of Williamsburg, basically. And that I would revolutionize world cinema forever. And obviously that didn't turn out to be, probably for the best. I actually think failing quite a lot as an artist has taught me good character traits. Hopefully I can see, I've known people that are instantly successful off the bat and then become bad artists, honestly.
Well, yeah, I think it's one of the really interesting things about this article that you wrote called On the Virtues of Cinematic Failure. And I wanted to, this seems like a good time to sort of jump into this, because you do talk about this fact that when you released Private Chat, that was a lot of people assumed that was your first feature, I guess because it was the first that had, wide distribution. But as you point out, you had 2 features before that, of which you're immensely proud, that you learned so much from, and that you hope that people will be inspired to go back and look at them. And so actually, part of the reason I wanted to have this conversation was to encourage people out there to do just that, because I think they're both, really, really interesting. And like you said, they have that energy of, the first film. And I think it's an interesting point that you make, though, that if you'd had that kind of, instant wide success right out of the gate, that maybe it would have, I don't know, maybe wouldn't have quite inspired you to go in some of the directions that you have since then. Could you talk a little bit about how the response to both Annunciation and then your follow-up feature, The Lion's Den, have sort of shaped how you went from there?
Yeah. So when I made Annunciation, I was really invested in sort of an alienating cinema. And what I mean by that is movies that don't function like naturalistic or realistic movies do. I wanted people to see the artifice of the filmmaking. I was really inspired by classic modernists like Bresson, Antonioni, Godard, maybe Ozu even, and Hitchcock, I would say. We think of him as a popcorn movie maker, but I don't think of him that way. But anyways, it was a very plastic movie. We shot it on film, and because of that, it was very low budget, as you can imagine. We didn't really have time to really run the scene all the way through with whatever shot we were doing. So, we would work for like 20 minutes and find the most perfect frame of somebody and say, okay, say your one line in this frame. And they're not even responding to anybody, which is hilarious and idiotic. And as a director, I would never make a movie that way. And now I'm way more interested in making movies about people and actors and psychology. But back then I was really interested in plastic filmmaking, where each frame is like a painting, basically. I think a lot of young filmmakers think that way until, I kind of realized film is not a visual medium at all. In my opinion, film is a metaphysical medium. You're recreating your world, whether that means quite directly your POV, what you see, but also what you think and how you interact with time and space. And that's not really a plastic approach to the world. But okay, so I made this this was the time of what I call American neo-realism, or some people call it mumblecore, like the Joe Swanberg type movies. Obviously, Lena Dunham was kind of by far the most famous director from our age group. And at the time, I've come to appreciate Joe Swanberg's work especially, but at the time I was really against that kind of stuff. I would always go around saying naturalism is not natural. What we need is a poetic cinema, an abstract cinema. And I realized it could just be because the film has its own shortcomings. And I also ended up editing the film many, many times. Like I did an early edit in 2011 when we shot it. We did some reshoots in 2012. I did an edit then. I think I had the first debut official like screening of it for an audience in 2013. I edited it again in 2014. I should say it's 3 shorts in one movie. So I tried it many different ways. There was a version of the movie where it was like a 20-minute short, 20-minute short, 20-minute short. So you have an hour-long movie. It's a feature, but it's sort of more like a novella length feature. I don't know what the movie term for that is. Featurette, I've heard. I like that length of movie. You don't see it too much anymore. But so, I had a version where it was like very choppy and very episodic. But one of the gags, or one of the tropes of the narrative style, is each main character of the shorts shows up in some permutation in either the background or interacting with the drama in the other 2 shorts. So it really lent itself to, okay, let's try a cut where we cross-cut the whole thing. And that's eventually where it kind of landed up now. I mean, I've kept editing this movie so many times. I even did an edit for fun during the pandemic in 2020. Just what else can I do with this footage? This movie is like my film school, because I'd shot so many things over 3 years, and because it's very loose narrative wise, you can make juxtapositions between all the images and all the stories. And I eventually settled on the edit that I did in 2020. I think is probably going to be the last one, because I really like it, where it kind of goes back. So the first 10 minutes, you're all with the main, the first short, the protagonist of the first short, but then it starts to cross cut pretty aggressively. And I think it really works in that way. And I'm actually quite proud of that movie. I like it just as much as Private Chat. There are things that I would never do again, but there are things that I wish and I want to go back to. What I like about it is it isn't interested in psychology per se. I was trying to sort of tell a story about the city and about the medium of film itself. The reason why I wanted to adapt the Marode altarpiece, which is an Annunciation scene, a triptych painting you can go see at the Cloisters, the medieval wing of the Metropolitan, way up right before you get to the Bronx, tip top of Manhattan, is I had this belief that cinema is just like the Annunciation scene, where, supposedly in the Christian mythology, light struck Mary's womb and an image in God's own likeness was created. Like, that's exactly what cinema is. You have light bouncing off somebody, coming back towards the lens, and an image in our own likeness is projected upon the screen. And similar to Christ, has a redeeming quality. It redeems the divine in the world. When you film the everyday, you're able to perceive it later on and experience the holiness of that moment. It's kind of a Byzantine idea, but yeah. So I had big ambitions. I was making a metaphysical statement about film. I was trying to say something political as well. Occupy Wall Street was happening at the time in November 2011. And because one of our protagonists was a Wall Street guy and we were down in Wall Street shooting all the time, we naturally just started going to the Occupy encampment and started interacting with it, with the actors. And probably the most enduring quality of the movie is we have true documentary footage of Occupy worked within the narrative. Yeah, I was interested in the geography of the city as well. Like, to me, like where each character lives impacts how they think and how they act. And I really wanted the map of it all to make perfect sense. It's very different than how I work now. Although, like I said, there are elements of that I'd like to get back to. But anyways, so to answer your question, so the movie did not play well. Even when I showed my close friends, when I'd rent a theater and show it to like 60 of my friends or colleagues or whatever, people from the scene, either the music scene or some of the film people I'd met in New York, people were like, this is really interesting. Simon did a beautiful job shooting it, but I can't get invested in it because I don't really buy the acting in it. And that's no fault of the actors in it. It's like how I told them to, I was into that Bressonian idea of don't emote, just be blank. And, and I was also into certain, what I now call hyperbolic styles of acting, where things are really exaggerated, kind of verging on not camp, but ham. Jean Renoir has this great concept. There's a difference between camp and ham. Ham, you can be over the top and exaggerating, but still be truthful. Whereas camp is inherently ironic, means you're playing the scene like you don't even believe the scene is for real. That's part of the delight of camp, and you know that there's great things to be done with that style. But I was interested in kind of extreme alienating flat acting or really hammy acting. And in fact, I doubled down on it because once Annunciation got rejected from all film festivals and people are like, this doesn't really play in the modern quote unquote indie landscape or whatever, my next film, Annunciation, almost became, Lion's Den became almost a manifesto against naturalistic acting. I was a young, hot-headed punk. So it was this kind of thing of like, oh, you don't like anti-naturalism? I'll show you what fucking anti-naturalism is like, you know?
I remember seeing the Lion's Den, actually both Annunciation and the Lion's Den, I think in like kind of private screenings that you had set up, and especially when the Lion's Den, with that one, I was really struck by the kind of stylized performances that you were directing there, which I do think stand out. I definitely, what I liked so much about it at the time, in fact, was how it sort of stood out from a lot of what you were seeing in that contemporary, indie film. The kind of the dominant styles of that moment of the early 2010s, like you were saying, kind of coming out of that mumblecore, so-called mumblecore moment. It was, I think it was, like you said, definitely true of Annunciation and especially of the Lion's Den, that there's sort of a reaction against that, in some way, a response to that, to that kind of naturalism. And I think it's
because to me it's a political point, because people always, if you go back to 19th century thinkers, like, the obvious one would be Marx or something. When people say, hey, the reason why women don't vote and the reason why women don't hold any power in the workplace or any political power is because that's the natural order. That's how people used to justify exploitation and all kinds of heinous acts, both politically and socially. And they would just say, oh, this is how it's always been done. It's natural. You still encounter that. I encounter that in the music world all the time. I have people at record labels or whatever, not mine right now, but that say, hey, we got to do this thing, even though, you might not want to do it, because this is how it's always been done. It's an argument from tradition, which is a total fallacy. Just because something's always been done a certain way doesn't mean it's the best way to do it. And so to me, there was a connection between naturalistic modes of filmmaking and that sort of insidious political thing, where if you do a mumblecore movie and you show the world as it exactly seems and how it quote unquote works, basically what you're saying is, I don't want to change the world. I want to just record the status quo, and I'm implicitly okay with that. Now, I think most quote unquote realist filmmakers are trying to show things as they actually are because they do want the world to change. But I actually am of the deep belief that truly revolutionary artwork in the political and the aesthetic sense of the term has to open new vistas and new ways of seeing and thinking. You can't just record the present tense. Now, to come full circle in my own work, I actually think that you can marry the two styles in a certain sense. And in fact, I've actually come to realize, I think that's what the essence of cinema is. What I like about cinema is you have the real world. When you when you point the camera at the world or a microphone at the world, you're genuinely recording the metaphysic real being of the world in the Heidegger sense of being. But then you can bring in all these literary ideas, you can bring in these philosophical ideas, you can bring in abstraction, and the more abstraction you can bring to realism and the more realism you can bring to abstraction. It's like there's some famous poet who said the best poems are taking two images that have the further apart they can be but still speak to each other. That's the best poetry. I love that idea. And to me, that relates to this concept of the further your abstract notions can be from what you're filming, but that you still reveal them in the everyday. That to me is what cinema can uniquely do that no other medium can really do. So all that's to say is, when I started making Private Chat, my third movie, I thought, okay, let me play in the mumblecore sandbox. Partially I have to thank Richard Brody, the film critic who writes for the New Yorker and has that great Godard biography, Everything is Cinema. He was a passionate defender of a lot of mumblecore movies, particularly Joe Swanberg, because he was really good at writing about the abstractions and the ideas that were in Joe's movies. And I started to rewatch them through this sort of Richard Brody lens. And I saw what he was talking about, and I realized, oh, you could do something like that, but take it even further. I could do some of the things that I was doing in Lion's Den, for example. And I'm someone that really likes what I like to call hijinks, like the rules of the game of it all, where there's love triangles and sort of some of the Shakespearean theatrical much ado about nothing elements that sort of have gotten sucked into cinema, where there's, love triangles, somebody's hiding in the closet when their lover is hooking up with somebody else. I love all that kind of theatrical parlor game kind of stuff. So I was like, okay, let me bring some of that, which is artificial and not naturalistic. Let me bring some of those elements into the mumblecore world, as well as some of the more sociological, political investigations, but into this naturalistic style. And I worked with Keith Poulsen, who's very famous mumblecore actor. I mean, I don't know if any mumblecore actor is famous, but you know what I mean. And then he's been in like 100 mumblecore movies. And Peter Vack, who is kind of associated with that style, as well as Julia Fox, who is now known for her stuff with, Uncut Gems, Safdie Brothers, and Soderbergh, who in his own way is sort of like a Hollywood mumblecore adjacent director. That may be a whole other conversation, but he is certainly a neo-realist. Or has been at times. I don't think, it would be fair to just put him completely in that zone. But yeah, so I worked in a quote unquote naturalistic sandbox, although there's many very unnaturalistic things about Private Chat. But I think I found my own way to kind of work within realism while still staying true to things that I really love about movies. And was able to make a movie that probably for the first time people had an emotional reaction to. And so
it's interesting how you kind of describe your journey with your relationship to mumblecore and naturalism, because I have had a pretty similar reaction myself to it over the years. I think initially I was kind of resistant to it for some reason. I might have been more drawn to I think there was things I was drawn to that were not really part of, the mumblecore, style, the mumblecore project. But as time has gone on, I think like yourself, I've kind of been drawn to those things that it does unique, that are unique to it, and trying to find a way to work with, your own interests and kind of bring them together. I wanted to jump back
what mumblecore does?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd say just one thing, because I think like the essence of Joe Swanberg's art and the best mumblecore movies is capturing cringe. And what I mean by that is that awkward moment where two people are hanging out and they don't quite know what to say and they don't quite know what to do. And 99% of movies, even art house movies historically, have always kind of cut over that stuff and smoothed it over. Whereas mumblecore movies were principally defiantly directed in a direction of, no, let's capture cringy, awkward interactions and force the audience to feel that awkwardness and to live in that moment. And I do love that. I do. It's very similar to horror movies where you trap somebody in a very specific moment and you don't let them leave that moment for like 10, 20 minutes. It's very unpleasant, but also very thrilling. Mumblecore is actually, they do that outside of genre. They do that within relationship dramas. When, two lovers are breaking up, let's just watch them fight it out for 20, 30 minutes. And it's extremely painful, but it's like, wow, that is exactly how that happens. And I found that really intoxicating as well. Getting
is a
closer
great observation
to the truth.
Yeah. That's a great point. And you're right. I think it's something about that working outside of genre that I also now find very appealing. I think it kind of exists in that, like you said, bringing together the reality and style, more stylized approach is now something you're interested in. And I wanted to, on that note, I wanted to jump back to something you mentioned, Richard Brody and his book on Godard. I want to ask you about Godard, because I know that at least in your earlier work, you've cited him as a big influence. Do you see some of these ideas that you're talking about with mumblecore, and then and also like your response to it, do you see some of that in Godard's work, and do you feel that that kind of comes in as an influence or a model for what you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always, for better or worse, Godard lives rent free in my head. I actually am more. I use Godard-esque ideas in my music more now. Like one of the big epiphanies of Bodega Bay, which eventually became the band Bodega, was, hey, why can't we make rock and roll music like Godard made films, which is essentially using rock and roll as a text to say very personal things, but through the apparatus of rock and roll. So it's like music about music, which a lot of Godard's, all of his work really are films about films. They're about so much more than that, but they use his cinephilia as a springboard to talk about himself. It isn't some mere academic exercise. This is, if I'm a person that thinks through the cinema, then everything, what I have to say about my own worldview has to be through the cinema, you know? So that's an idea that's always been appealing to me. But really, I think about Godard most when I'm just framing a shot or something. He was a master at finding the right angle, always at capturing a moment and not having to get coverage. You know, when you're, I'm enamored of 80s Godard's films, you know, that stretch from Every Man for Himself through King Lear, where he's kind of making this very stately, melancholy, kind of grand cinema that's still kind of on a smaller scale, but is really interested in the metaphysics of the world. And, you know, what I love in those movies is say he's filming a simple conversation between two people. He may never even show one of the other people. He'll shoot like a trad over the shoulder coverage of over one of the speaker's shoulders, showing a close up of the person talking, like you would see in television. And you would expect, you know, by the time the next person talks or has a big reaction to what one person says, we would cut to the other person. Maybe we would cut to a 2-shot eventually of both of them talking. You know, TV or even trad cinema, you know, we would cover it so we can really see everything. Godard was committed to this idea of like, no, we're going to see what's important to see, and we'll hold on that for the entire length of the conversation. It's not like he didn't shoot coverage, but he only did when it was made sense and was absolutely necessary. You get the sense. I mean, my relationship with Godard changes all the time. I see so many shortcomings in his cinema the older I get. You know, it used to be Godard is God and he can do no wrong. Now, almost every time I watch a Godard movie, I'm like, okay, he almost doubles down on some of his things. Partially, I almost want to say, you know, sorry to all the Godard heads out there, sort of a laziness or like a lack of wanting to investigate further. And I actually think that like his total disregard for narrative pleasure most of the time is because he's a bad storyteller, which, you know, and that's fine. Godard is still the greatest for me because movies are not, at the end of the day, really just about storytelling. But I feel like he almost turned his absolute weakness into a strength. But the fact that he, like, for the most part, is not interested in the thoughts of most people in front of his camera, I think was a moral failing, as well as definitely an artistic failing.
It's interesting just to get kind of to quote your own article here to you. You know, you're talking about seeing seeing Godard for the first time, you know, as a college student, and you mentioned this quote from or about Pierre Le Fou. You say it's Godard said it's not really a film; it's an attempt at a film, which I think is kind of you know, interesting to think about in relation to these shortcomings you're describing. And I also one more quote from your article here that I think is relevant here. You say, my early cinematic attempts certainly failed at behaving like normal movies, but to me, it is precisely this failure that makes them interesting. And I think that is something that, you know, can also be said of Godard's work in a lot of ways. And but you know, that idea of failure, I want to ask you about this because I heard this said somewhere else not too long ago in relation to the idea of failure and filmmaking. And I think it's probably true of anybody who's taking any kind of an experimental approach in making a movie, that in this conversation I was listening to, it was said that I believe the filmmaker being interviewed said that they actually kind of reject the idea of failure in filmmaking, and that, or even sometimes embrace the idea of failure in filmmaking, in that it's kind of like the old idea, I guess, that any accident or failure or mistake is an opportunity to learn. But I think also moving beyond that, it's seeing what comes out of those failures, quote unquote failures, or those moments where the movie doesn't behave like a quote unquote normal movie. I'm curious in your work. Well, first of all, I'm curious in your earlier features, was that something that you were ever, conscious of, that even if something didn't work, something more interesting would come out of it? And second, is it something that you still would describe as part of your filmmaking approach today?
Yes. Godard had this wonderful quote, "Let's seek the definitive by chance." That is what art making really is. You might know what you're going to write about when you say you're a novelist and you sit down to write, but anybody that writes knows something happens where whatever you planned becomes developed and expanded and complicated, and it's never going to turn out as neat on the page as what you planned. And especially that's true of a medium like cinema, where you're filming the actual world. You cannot control the world, nor should you. So you have to embrace all of that. I personally like to be really prepared when I go to direct a scene. I like to perhaps have done a storyboard or a shot list, or have really thought about what it is, but usually I'll completely throw it away. And in the case of Private Chat and Lines Then, I was the DP. So, if I have the camera on my shoulder, you can be really, really free. Obviously, you have to think about where the lights are and what the actors want to do, but you can improvise. Godard would improvise on a whole new level. He would bring brand new pages of a script the day of a scene was happening. This is like his famous way of working, which is very frustrating for the actors. But it's like, hey, we're just going to do this because I had this thought this morning, and it's more real to me now and more present to me now than anything I could have written in a script 6 months ago would have been. It's such a beautiful idea of really just letting the present intermingle with the work. And I work like that too, but I don't write brand new scenes in the morning for the most part. And I'm, like the films I'm making now are far more, I'm far more invested in what I would call narrative pleasure or psychology of characters or whatever. So, but you have to be open to what the space tells you. To me, movies are often about space. My favorite scenes in movies are where you feel like you're actually in the room and you could smell what's in the room. You can hear what's in the room. This is what the first movies that really spoke to me, other than maybe Star Wars or some Disney stuff like Fantasia when I was a little kid, would have been slasher movies. Because when you get that wide angle lens and you get all of a sudden Jason's POV and he's stalking the campers in Friday the 13th, time slows down and I actually feel like I'm in the woods. I almost feel like I'm watching like a camera test or something of like somebody walking around the woods with a fisheye lens. And that was the moment where I became aware of what a camera or a lens could do when, I was, let's say, 12 years old watching these movies. And I'm still kind of like chasing that thing. I don't know if this is a great answer to your movie, but yes, you have to let chance and I've been saying to a lot of friends for the last 5 years, I've been reading way more than I've been watching movies, because I'm so disappointed that movies never even try to be as truthful as the novel can be for the most part. There's tons of bad books as well, but there's a freedom in the best writing that just, you can capture what it's like to really go through a very idiosyncratic experience and all the different vectors of how a person can think about that one experience that people rarely even attempt in movies, because they're just trying to get the plot beats and the right, we're trying to get the inciting incident by page 15. We're trying to thrust you into the act 2 by page 29. They're so, movies for commercial reasons and for other reasons are, they have to be tight. Whereas the novel by definition is pretty loose. And I think, Godard is one of the only filmmakers that aspired to work like the true premise of the camera stilo, that famous article about why can't we be as free with the camera as we could with the pen. So in that way, Godard will always be a model. But I think he came short in many ways. So there's still work to be done, of course. And I think the cinema of this century is going to be perhaps not as classical and as grand and iconic as the 20th century was, but it'll be far more interior and far more philosophically rich. And so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, that's I just have to draw an interesting connection there. You're saying that you find yourself reading a lot more these days than watching films, and I can only echo that from my own experience. I for the last several years, I would say I'm reading far more books than watching films, and that used to sort of be, the inverse was true for me. But I'm not sure if that. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure why it does. It is a different experience, and I think at this point, maybe I'm finding that, like you say, the novel provides certain experiences that film maybe the film doesn't provide, or that I've just simply experienced so many times through film that there's something, maybe I'm just seeking something different, a different experience, and novels provide that. But I think you're absolutely right that tying that approach to filmmaking seems to be a path that, a direction that could be really exciting, might really open a lot of new possibilities for filmmakers to think about. I want to. We're running short on time here, but there was something I wanted to just ask you about quickly before we get to Jack London calling. And this is going a little bit outside of what we've been talking about here, but it does relate to Godard. So Godard has this quote that I've been trying to find the source of it because I'm really intrigued by it. Maybe he referred to short films as anti-cinema, and I believe this was from what I've been able to figure out, he must have said this early in his career, I think probably around the time of Breathless even. And I have a feeling what he was referring to, just based on the context where I've seen the quote, was that I think he was referring to short films as like the calling card or the gateway into the established industry. Yes. Now, are you familiar with that quote? I'm not sure that I have the context correct, but that's how I interpreted it when I heard it.
I'm not familiar with the quote, but how I would interpret it is obviously he was working as a critic, didn't want to be a critic, wanted to be a filmmaker. And then he found himself making 5 or 6 short films, didn't want to be making short films, wanted to be making features. So you're saying, yes, this thing I've been doing is not the real deal. Of course I want to be making every filmmaker has ambitions to make features. Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't you? Nobody has an ambition to make the perfect 4-minute movie. You know what I mean? Maybe somebody does.
Well, I was curious. Because I know you have made a couple of shorts yourself, and I was wondering if you have whether you want to draw a parallel to literature or the short story versus the novel. I was just curious if you had any anything you could share on your position of shorts versus features. Do you kind of find yourself in agreement with the Godard, the idea that if you want to make a feature, just go for it? I was just curious if you had any thoughts you could share on shorts versus features.
I love a good short. I think shorts are harder for a lot of reasons. And probably one of my favorite movies of all time is a short. It's a long short, the Renoir Day in the Country. I find that to be maybe his best movie. It's stunning. I guess it's like 45 minutes or something. So maybe it's a feature. I don't know. But there's something sketch-like about a short, which I find really moving. And the two of the shorts I've done, certainly 2 of the most thought-out shorts I did, which would be, there's one called Storefront Modigliani and a sequel of sorts, or really a conceptual sequel called Little Labyrinth. I thought of those as sort of like one-act plays. They kind of spin off from the Lion's Den style in the sense that they're very theatrical. I was really interested in that format. I don't have, like the length of media is really arbitrary. Yeah. Like the fact that movies are 90 minutes to 2 hours is only really, it's just an arbitrary number. Maybe it has something to do with people's attention spans or commercial restrictions or whatever. There's no reason why you couldn't make, and people obviously have, way longer movies or way shorter movies. I foresee a future where more and more personal films are made where the 45-minute movie could become more normalized and actually would maybe make the most sense for certain types of material. This is what I was talking about earlier about like the beats that people talk about. Like, you got to have the inciting incident by page 12 to 15, and then you got to, thrust the audience into act 2 by page 29, and then there's some kind of midpoint, and then the innermost cave, to use the hero's journey analogy, and then some kind of climax, and all that has to happen in a prescribed time is really arbitrary. I mean, we see the same thing in music. Even to this day, every label I've ever worked with thinks of the album in terms of vinyl. They're like, okay, put one of the key tracks as side B, track 1. Because when people are playing the vinyl, if they play the wrong side first, you still want it to be an absolute hit. You know what I mean? And of course that means you can only have 22 minutes per side. Otherwise you lose some fidelity. So like average records needed to be 44 minutes, or you had to do a double album. There are ways around that, of course, but it's just strange that we've come so far as a culture away from vinyl, arguably. I mean, it's had its comebacks here and there, but yet it still determines how we make the thing. You could say the same of cinema. We don't shoot on celluloid anymore for the most part. We don't even show movies with a projector and a bunch of reels. So why are we still beholden to this format, especially when people don't really like my kinds of movies? Other than if it's a small film festival, you're going to be watching this movie at home anyway. So why are we so beholden to these like industry norms when they may not actually serve the material as best as possible?
Right. Well, before we wrap up, I do want to get to your upcoming project, Jack London Calling, which you describe as a punk romantic comedy starring Katie Alice Greer and Peter Vack. What would you like to tell us about that and your fundraising efforts?
Yeah. Well, we're currently fundraising right now I'm going the crowdfunding route. So if anybody wants to see this movie, please find the link. There's just a GoFundMe. If you look us up on Instagram or just a little Googling, I bet you can find it. But we're shooting the first 30 minutes of the movie the last week of August. I'm not sure when this will come out, but we're heavily into pre-production right now. And the idea is to shoot the first 30 minutes, which we can now afford. And then, we'll need to raise money to do the rest of it. But I'm kind of looking forward to working this way because I can edit the first 30 minutes because I edit all my own stuff and see what's working and what isn't. So that'll be interesting. The movie stars Katie Alice Greer as a punk rock front woman named Sue. The movie Jack London Calling title comes from the name of the fictional band that we're going to follow throughout the whole movie. So, throughout most of my life, I would always do one album and then start writing a script and then maybe do another album and then maybe start editing that movie after I shot it. So I've kind of gone back and forth for like the first 15 years of my real working artistic life, is kind of oscillating between cinema and rock and roll. And for the first time, I thought, why don't I combine them and make cinema about rock and roll? I wanted to make a movie about a band, a local Brooklyn band that doesn't really have a following yet, that actually captures what being in a struggling local band is actually like, and actually feature musicians that are in my world. And I have a lot to say about that world. So let's construct a narrative and a world in which we can communicate these things. It's also similar to Private Chat. It's a romance. All my movies, for the most part, are about couples. To me, it's the most interesting thing you can make movies about, for me, at least right now. So it's a romance set within the rock and roll milieu. Partially, part of that reason is I know that world and have access to that world, so could make a quality movie for very, very cheap. I'm never going to write a movie that like is set at an airport or in a stadium or not anytime soon. I'm not going to make the Odyssey. I think independent filmmakers, part of the advantage we have is we're almost encouraged to make movies about our world. And all my movies star the people that I see throughout most of my waking life and are set in the places that I work in. Private Chat is completely in me and my partner Nikki's apartment. And so when I watch that movie, it's not just a a documentary of what I was thinking at the time while making the movie. It's a documentary of literally the space I was in when I was making the movie. You know, Hollywood movies just are not interested in that kind of filmmaking. I am. I find that really beautiful, and it's closer to what the novelist does. Like if you read Proust, he wants you to understand the room in which he's writing his own books in, and what all the rooms that he was in his whole life, because the rooms influence the thinking. You know, eventually it'd be fun to make movies with more money, but I don't think I would ever change that practice. I'm still trying to film my world. I've been giving guitar lessons for money for the last couple of years. And so naturally I made my protagonist a guitar instructor. So there are going to be scenes where she does basically what I do every day. Why not? I'm documenting my life. So that's
Well, it sounds intriguing, and looking forward to seeing it as it comes along. So I will make sure to share that the GoFundMe link with this episode, and with that we can wrap things up here. I really appreciate your time today. It's been great speaking with you. I think one of the most in-depth conversations we've ever actually had about your filmmaking. So that's been I've enjoyed it on a personal level. Thanks again for coming on today, and thanks everyone for watching, and I'll talk to you soon, Ben.
Thanks so much. I'm a big fan of what you do, both as a director and all of your work in capturing low budget filmmaking. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.